veteran killed with a single bullet.
I think he shot himself.
Really?
Would a suicidal person shoot themselves in the chest?
A hidden clue leads Lieutenant Joe Kenda through a tangled web of sex and intrigue.
She is someone of interest to me. Why do you behave like this? Why do you dress like this?
But who is really pulling the strings?
I didn't know he had a gun.
I can't prove Glenn did anything other than he's got dope in his house.
Are they trying to lead us down the wrong path?
The three most common motives in murder: money, sex, and revenge. That's starting to work for me. Anytime you talk to anyone in a murder case, particularly one who says they know all about this, you always take that information with a jaundiced eye. Why are you so willing to lay this off on somebody other than you? Maybe you had a part in this.
1:30 a.m. It's a warm night in Colorado Springs.
John Carson, an EMT here in town, was sleeping. When he hears a frantic knock on his front door.
You know, when somebody bangs on your door in the middle of the night, the first thing you think of is, am I in danger? When he looks at the people, he sees his neighbor covered in blood.
Curtis is hurt.
John, as an EMT, has some medical training. His neighbor knows this.
Can you help? John grabs his stuff and runs to William's apartment. Sees a man laying on the floor. Blood was everywhere. CPR.
Call 911! Gonna lose him! It's not working!
As John is conducting the CPR on the victim, he realizes this is not working.
He needs help, and he needs help now. He's not gonna make it!
In a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of town, Lieutenant Joe Kenda hopes his workday is finally coming to an end.
I had come home that night late from a call, and I woke up one of my dogs, who was a little bitty guy named Fritz. He wanted to go out, so I've got to let him out. I lived out of town, and there were coyotes, who are predators. And Fritz is just the right size to get taken by one of them. So I would always watch him when he was out.
Damn. Fritz! Fritz, come on, boy. Come on in. It's Kenda. Uh-huh. All right, I'll be right there. Now you come in.
20 minutes later, Kenda arrives at a neighborhood unaccustomed to the flashing red and blue of police activity.
The 2500 block of East Uinta has a large apartment complex in it. It's a nice, usually very quiet area. Lieutenant.
So what do we got?
A single male, gunshot wound to the chest.
When I arrived, I'm told that Curtis Ashley, who's a 28-year-old man, had been removed by ambulance and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital.
Curtis Ashley was a kind soul that had a good heart, somebody who had just gotten out of the service and was getting ready to start his civilian life and see where that led.
Any family roommates?
Yeah, you get two, William and Sheila here. The two individuals that were present at the scene were William and Sheila. This was their apartment.
They had allowed the victim to stay with them and had been staying with them for approximately 3 to 4 weeks.
You want to talk to him now?
Now we'll look at the crime scene first.
When I walk into this apartment, I look at, of course, the bloodstain, which is enormous, and it's on a futon-type sofa.
We're assuming this is where the victim was crashing.
He didn't do much sleeping tonight, did he?
There is a large amount of blood. It's soaked through the cushion on the futon.
It was obviously a gunshot wound.
High velocity blood spatter is only produced by gunshot. So obviously, he's there on the bed when he takes this bullet.
I got bone fragments here.
Unless a bullet strikes the body where the skin is directly over bone, for example, the forehead, bone fragments will not be part of the blowback. It will all be pushed forward by the bullet. So even though that body's not here, the bone fragments tell me there was an exit wound.
The bullet's got to be here somewhere.
I want that bullet. That is what killed this man, and we have to know its point of origin. I noticed something in the drywall that might be a bullet hole.
Here it is.
When I shine the light through that hole, I can see that there is a base of a slug lodged in a stud inside the wall. That is probably the fatal round.
We're gonna need that bullet.
We're gonna have to cut through that drywall to get at it.
Whatever you gotta do.
Yes, sir.
We will go to any length to include any level of damage to a property to recover those projectiles.
Hey, look at this.
That's a 380. Go ahead and bag it.
Could that be the gun that was used? Of course. It's here, and it's very close to where all this blood is.
We need to get this gun fingerprinted.
If this gun fired the deadly round, a clean print could immediately identify the killer.
The guy was shot here. He definitely didn't die here. We have a blood trail going down the hallway.
It's William and Sheila's room in the back.
Why would a guy give his last bit of life to go down this hallway?
What exactly is he doing? Does he get up? And does he maneuver down this hallway, getting blood from his wound on these walls? Is he looking to get away from who did this?
For answers, Kenda turns to the couple who lives here.
I arbitrarily select William Parks as the first guy for me to talk to.
All right, you can go. I'll take it from here. So, William, what's your relationship with Curtis Ashley?
We're friends.
He said that Curtis had fallen on some hard times. Him and his girlfriend had broke up, and he had no place to stay, so we let him stay in his apartment for a couple of weeks. What happened here tonight?
Well, we'd all gone off to bed. Me and Sheila were sleeping, and then around 1 a.m., I heard a gunshot. What was that?
When he sees Curtis Ashley leaning against the door frame, saying he needs help, he turns to return to the living room and literally falls face first onto the floor. Now, William is awake, and he turns on a light, jumps out of bed, and sees a large hole in Curtis's back.
So it's just you, your wife, and Curtis in the apartment when the shooting happened?
Yes, sir.
What do you think happened here?
Well, he'd been sleeping with his gun, so maybe he rolled over in his sleep and it went off.
Really?
People sleep with many things. Very few people sleep with a gun. That really piqued my interest when he said that.
You think he accidentally shot himself in his sleep?
Yeah.
He couldn't think of any other reason why Curtis would have been shot other than an accidental shooting. All right, stay right here.
Is it possible he shot himself in the chest with a semi-automatic pistol while he's in bed, accidentally? Yeah, possible. Is it likely? No, it isn't. No, it isn't.
Hoping for an account that better suits the facts, Kenda turns to William's common-law wife, Sheila.
Sheila, Lieutenant Kenda.
I ask her the same kinds of questions I ask William, and I'm getting the same kinds of reply.
Yeah, he was a really great guy. We really liked him. But he was kind of going through a lot, so we were trying to help him out.
But then she says something completely different than her common-law husband.
What happened here tonight?
I think he shot himself.
Excuse me?
He was really depressed. He had this girlfriend, Hannah, and she just broke up with him. I was trying to, cheer him up a little bit, convince him things were going to get better. Okay?
No,
What's going on?
it's Hannah. It's everything.
She further said he had just discovered a few days earlier that Hannah had already jumped into a relationship with somebody else. He therefore believed he had not only been discarded, but he had been forgotten. Would a suicidal person shoot themselves in the chest? That is a very rare thing. Suicidal people want to make certain this is going to work. They shoot themselves in the head.
You and your husband are telling very different stories. Stay right here.
What I focus on is what is likely, not what's possible. This is getting curiouser and curiouser. The more we ask and the more we learn, the less I like this.
Kenda's suspicions only deepen when he hears back from CSI.
Hey, Lieutenant. CSI pulled a bullet out of the wall behind the bed.
What's the caliber?
It's a .45.
Now the gun we covered from the base of the bed is the .380. Can a .380 fire a .45 caliber bullet? No, it can't.
Were any other guns recovered?
No, sir. Just the victims.
That bullet, that piece of lead stuck in a wooden stud, says there is no suicide. There is no accident. This is a murder. And who is present in this room that's still alive? William Parks and Sheila Conway, that's who. We're investigating the death of Curtis Ashley, who was shot in his residence.
Curtis's roommates William Parks and Sheila Conway claim Curtis shot himself. But a .45 caliber bullet recovered from the wall suggests otherwise.
That bullet says this is a murder.
Are they trying to lead us down the wrong path?
They're our best leads at this point. They're also our best suspects.
I need to talk to the two of you. Either one of you own a gun?
No.
Because Curtis's gun isn't the one that killed him. This wasn't a suicide. This isn't an accident. This is a murder.
Somebody killed him. Is that somebody you? Is that why you're lying to me?
Let's go inside and talk about it.
William understands all of a sudden that this is going south on him and his common-law wife. Now they become really distressed.
You think it's us? We did it?
I'm telling you, it wasn't us.
We really are trying to lean on them as possible suspects, but they're adamant about they're not involved.
Are you interested in proving you didn't shoot Curtis? Because there's a test we can do on your hands that'll show if either one of you shot a gun.
Sheila and William agree to submit to a gunshot residue test.
The GSR test is the only way to determine if they've fired a gun. There's going to be a certain amount of smoke, unburned powder particles, and various other chemicals that come out of the weapon and onto the hand of the shooter. If you fire that gun, there's going to be a result, and it's going to say yes or no.
The GSR test confirms that neither William nor Sheila fired a gun that evening.
The results are negative, Lieutenant.
Neither of them?
Neither of them.
Thank you.
So it's apparent that we now have a third person, unidentified, who somehow came into this apartment in the middle of the night and shot and killed Curtis Ashley and then left.
So we checked for any signs of forced entry?
Yeah, we did, but nothing. Nothing on doors or windows.
Sometimes I forget to lock up.
All right, I'll see who's available. Start at canvas.
At this point, we're going to be contacting neighbors. They're probably our best leads.
It's early in the morning, we're gonna be waking people up, but we need to do that to find out if there's anybody out there who heard or saw anything that would help in this investigation.
Real guns are real loud. They are startlingly loud. This is a 45 caliber weapon. It's gonna go kaboom. So when we conduct our neighborhood follow-up, we turn a guy.
Hey, CSPD, sorry to bother you. We're checking around. We're trying to find out.
I heard a gunshot.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
This individual, his name is Dale Drummond. He tells us he hears a gunshot and he is immediately awake.
Yeah, I've got somebody here with some information. We're down at the end of the hallway. It may have been close to 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning before I talked to a detective, but it was not one of those nights that you could go back to sleep.
Hey, I'm Lieutenant Kenda.
Dale Drummond.
So you saw something tonight?
Yeah, I heard gunshots. Woke me up from a dead sleep, kind of freaked me out.
I have a familiarity with guns, so when I heard it, I knew pretty much right away what it was.
What happened next?
Dogs started freaking out in the backyard.
He looks out in the yard. He sees 2 humans. Silhouettes only. It's dark. He has no outside light in his backyard. And they are scaling a 6-foot fence. He can't even describe them because of the darkness. But when they're scaling the fence, he hears one of them say, "Hurry up, let's get out of here." And it's a male voice. Then over the fence they go, into the car, and gone.
That's all I can tell.
Dale's tip gives detectives a much-needed break.
So now we not only have a Mr. X. Mr. X has a friend. It can be good that there is more than one involved. Catch one, you catch the other one.
Thank you. No problem.
Based on Dale's statement, we're very interested in following the path that these individuals may have taken, looking for physical evidence, anything that might help in this case.
Dale said he saw the guys go over the fence somewhere in here.
A 6-foot privacy fence doesn't sound like a formidable obstacle, but in reality it is. You do a lot of scrambling before you actually get over this thing.
Should be some scuff marks or damage where they went over.
Yeah, look at this. Right here.
There's fresh scuff marks on the fence.
Pretty much gives us the exact location where they went over.
What's that?
Piece of a wristwatch, maybe?
Faggot.
Now, somebody goes over the fence. They're grabbing with anything they got. Did they break their watch? I think so.
Let's see if we find the rest of the watch around here.
Now we look for a watch, we don't find one, but we've got the watch strap. That could be significant.
But a watch strap isn't all the 2 suspects left behind.
Hey, Lieutenant. Got something for you. On the other side of the fence, we actually find a package of cigarettes. A generic brand packet of cigarettes.
Generic brand cigarettes are less expensive than the named brands of cigarettes.
Looks like our guys smoked the cheap stuff. Well, they've definitely been left here in the last day or so. Otherwise they'd be funky laying out here in the grass. Let's go ahead and bag them.
So we're considering all this, and we don't have a lot, but we got more than we had to begin with. Maybe we can turn this pack of cigarettes and that watch band into 2 dudes. Wouldn't that be nice?
Then, as luck would have it, a new lead falls right into Kenda's lap.
Go for Kenda.
We get a call that there's somebody at the police station who says that he's a good friend of Curtis Ashley's, and he thinks he might know who's responsible for this. Well, this is getting better by the minute.
10-4 will be right there. Kenda out. Want to keep searching? Let me know if you find anything else.
Yes, sir.
Let's go.
This is Gary Cobalt.
Hey, Gary. Have a seat. Thanks for coming in. I understand you have some information about the murder of Curtis Ashley.
His ex-girlfriend did it.
Well, that's a pretty direct accusation. Why don't you explain that, Gary? Why do you think that's the case?
Hannah and Curtis fought all the time.
I can't live like this anymore!
They're always breaking up, on again, off again. But this last time they broke up, she was telling everyone she put a contract out on him.
Really?
She said, "I want that son of a bitch dead."
He further explains that he is well aware that Hannah is friends with violent gang members and that therefore he believes that she has the ability to perhaps carry out a specified murder for hire, with Curtis being the victim.
Curtis was so terrified he started sleeping with a gun.
Well, no. He was sleeping with a gun, wasn't he?
You're going to ask you an odd question.
Okay.
What kind of cigarettes do you smoke?
I used to tell my detectives, I don't trust anybody. I don't trust my mother, and she's been dead for 11 years.
No, I don't smoke.
Ever have?
So Hannah obviously becomes the focus of our case. Could it be that Hannah had this guy killed? Yes, it could. The femme fatale. We've learned a lot in this case so far about the death of Curtis Ashley. Not enough, of course. But now we have a point of focus.
A witness, a broken watch, and a pack of cigarettes lead Kenda to believe 2 men killed Curtis. But now Kenda suspects a scheming ex-girlfriend may also be involved.
We have Miss Anna Tracy, who is alleged to be the mastermind of Curtis's death.
She's right next to him. We want to find out, is she involved in this? Did she do this?
Hannah opens the door in this low-cut jumpsuit affair.
Can I help you?
And obviously is a woman who is very taken by her own appearance.
I'm Lieutenant Kenda, this is Detective Ritz. We're investigating the death of Curtis Ashley.
Of course you are. Come in.
She knows why we're there. She knows that we're coming. She's not surprised that we're there.
Nice tea. Water, maybe?
No, thank you.
She is someone of interest to me. Why do you behave like this? Why do you dress like this?
Please. Sit down.
I'm not going to beat around the bush. Some people told us you put a contract out on Curtis. Now Curtis ends up dead.
I just said I had a contract on Curtis. Do I really look like that kind of girl? Look, detectives, it's a long story. Did you know Curtis was a drug addict?
Well, no, I didn't know that. So I asked her to explain. What do you mean a drug addict?
Well, he used and he sold so he can use. We were always broke. That's why we kept breaking up. Curtis! Curtis! Are you serious?
Baby, what do you want from me? I swear to God I'm trying to quit.
The minute you say drugs and then you say dead guy, this is an enormous complication when they're both uttered in the same breath.
And the guys he had money to started coming around here, roughing him up, threatening me.
You know I'm good for the money, man. If you don't pay me, you are a dead man.
Is this why you were together or after you broke up?
Both. Anyway, I figured if I started telling everybody I had a hit on Curtis, and those guys who were after him, they'd know we weren't together anymore. And that I wasn't someone they wanted to mess with.
Hannah's concerned for her own welfare, so she's building a protective wall through threats or veiled threats to try to get these people to leave her alone.
After we listen to her, it becomes apparent to me that this is not Hannah, the contract murderer.
There are now a lot of different reasons why he might be killed. If he was dealing drugs, was he dealing with the wrong person? Did he cheat somebody?
Well, assuming your story is true, can you think of anyone that would want Curtis dead?
Probably Panhead Glenn. He owed Glenn money for drugs.
Panhead Glenn? Now, Panhead was a design of a Harley-Davidson motorcycle engine. Glenn is an owner of a Panhead Harley. Hence, they call him Panhead Glenn. He says that Glenn is an ex-con. He's done time for shooting people in the past. Well, that's interesting. Not only does he have maybe a reason to be mad at Curtis, but he has experience.
So how do you know Panhead Glenn so well?
Well, we kind of had a thing for a while.
Had or have?
Well, you know, feelings, they come and they go.
When was the last time you saw Curtis?
Just last week, he helped me out moving some stuff. We even talked about getting a drink soon.
So you were thinking about getting back together with him?
I like this mix. The three most common motives in murder: money, sex, and revenge. We have money, and now we've introduced sex. That's starting to work for me.
Okay, well, thank you for your help, and I'm sorry for your loss.
So we turn to leave, and she follows us outside. And she turns to me, and she's trying to be cute, and she asks me,
Hey, do you have a light?
she pulls out a pack of cigarettes. I'm very curious about that. She doesn't know I was curious about it.
Yes, I do.
But it's not the generic brand that's found in that backyard. It's a major brand.
Thanks.
No problem.
I lit her cigarette and we moved on.
Kenda isn't sure he believes all of Hannah's story, but it rings true enough to turn their attention to the man known as Panhead Glenn.
Glenn Sapp did time for first-degree assault. You want to pay him a visit?
Let's go check with narcotics, see what we got on him first.
Convicts don't respond out of fear, they only respond out of pressure. We want to put ourselves in a position where we've got some kind of a hammer on Panhead before we ever talk to him about Curtis Ashley.
Hey, Sterling.
Hey, Lieutenant, how you doing?
Good. You guys know a guy that goes by the name of Panhead Glenn?
As a matter of fact, we do. You got an active investigation of this guy right now.
He's a player. He doesn't move a lot of weight, but he moves some.
We're looking at him for murder. Have you guys got anything on him that we could use?
Enough for a search warrant.
They have enough to get a search warrant for his house to find drug evidence, and if it is found in his home, he gets arrested for it. This is excellent pressure. That is terrific news.
All right, you want to get on that? Want to give the SWAT team a call?
Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
The Narcotics Division agrees to collaborate with Homicide and conduct a surprise visit to the home of Panhead Glenn.
Anytime you conduct a raid involving narcotics, you take a lot of people with you, so there's no resistance, and you take a dog because it's a lot easier to use the dog rather than spend all night in there trying to find something the dog can find in 30 seconds.
Step that way.
Any children or animals inside? What's your name?
The man identifies himself as Derek Peters, not Glenn Sapp. But the search quickly proves to be a fruitful one for narcotics.
Because we surprised him with our arrival, there's half a key of cocaine on the coffee table, in plain view, and the dog immediately goes over it like, look at this, boys.
Hey, Lieutenant, about this guy hiding in the closet.
What's your name?
Glenn Sapp.
Excellent. Arrest him.
Can't find you back.
Well, no. So the search continues. But nonetheless, he's in possession of Schedule II controlled substance. It's a felony, and he is a parolee. And now, therefore, we own him. He's arrested and charged.
as the canine team sweeps the final room of the house. The dog detects something else of interest.
As they approach one of the bedrooms, the dog just goes crazy.
Lieutenant, I think we got something else in here.
What's going on?
There's a pile of dirty laundry on the floor, and it starts to move.
Now time to win, so.
Someone underneath there, you better come out now!
We're at Pinhead Glenn's house, and we have a couple people in custody already, and we're about to apparently have a third one under a pile of dirty laundry.
You're on safety, now's the time to reveal yourself.
So this woman stands up by these dirty clothes, and she is so frightened she's visibly shaking.
It's kind of like, really? You couldn't find a better place to hide than that?
Who are you?
I'm Kitty. I surrender.
Step out here.
Kitty reveals that she is the wife of Derek Peters.
Kitty is obviously our weak link, because that dog had put the fear of God in her. So we talked to her right away.
You live here?
Yes.
You all live here? Yes. Have you always lived here together? Yes. All three of us. We live here together. Okay.
Where were you last night?
I was home.
How about Derek and Glenn?
They went to some carnival in town.
So she puts Derek and Glenn together, and they're out of her sight on the evening of the murder. And I know I'm looking for two males. This is really coming home.
It's not a far stretch to think that maybe Derek is the second individual involved.
One more thing.
I look on the coffee table, there's a pack of generic cigarettes. The right kind of generic cigarette. The same brand that was in the backyard.
You smoke spades?
No, I hate those.
Whose are those?
Glenn or Derek's, they both smoke those.
Oh, really? That's very convenient.
Let's go.
Kitty is taken into custody for the possession of the cocaine that was found in the house. She's taken over to the Narcotics Bureau. Derek and Glenn are both transported down to the Homicide Bureau for further interviews.
All right, Glenn. Why don't you tell me how you know Curtis Ashley?
Curtis who?
Brian Rist is talking to Glenn, and I'm watching from behind a mirror.
Curtis Ashley. Curtis Ashley.
You know anybody by that name?
He's a very cocky, smug kind of guy.
He don't know nothing about nothing. He knows his name is Glenn. Reasonably sure his last name is Sapp, and he never heard of anybody named Curtis Ashley.
See, we think you do know Curtis, Glenn. Matter of fact, we think you have business dealings with him.
Not me.
He's denying anything. He wants to know why he's there. Even when we point out there's a lot of drugs in the house, he comes up with some bizarre statement.
Oh, well, you know what? My ex-wife recently died, and they did drop off a bunch of her boxes at my place, and I haven't had a chance to go through them, so she may have had drugs in there, but, you know, they weren't mine.
Oh, please. So your tragically dead ex-wife is in fact responsible for the drugs. You forgot to say the elephant stepped on your homework. You forgot that part.
Glenn, we found half a kilo of cocaine on your coffee table. Right out in the open.
You know what? Why don't you give me a few days? I'll find a good lawyer, and, you know, then I'll come back and talk to you.
Glenn, you're already under arrest for the drug charges. Stand up. I know.
With Glenn refusing to talk, detectives face an uphill battle making a murder charge stick.
I can't prove Glenn did anything other than he's got dope in his house. I need either something to be found in that house, or I need Derek to tell me where they went that night and what they did when they got there. So I checked with my officers doing the search, and I said, so what do we got?
This is Kenda.
Yes, Lieutenant.
So what have you found so far? Did you uncover a gun?
No gun. I got something else for you. Got a watch with a broken off buckle.
Ooh, I like that.
The officer tells Kenda the watch was found on Derek Peters' dresser.
Oh, that's perfect. I need to bring that down here immediately.
Yes, sir. I'll send it right over.
So we have found the part of the watch that wasn't attached to the fence in Curtis Ashley's neighbor's backyard.
That's a key piece of evidence to tie him to this case.
So, Derek, last night your wife said you and Glenn went out?
Yeah, we went to the carnival.
Okay.
You know, went on some rides, walked around, had some drinks, and came home. I didn't find out about Curtis Ashley until the next day.
Yeah, right. The only way you get a confession is pressure. When you apply the pressure and you continue to tighten the screws, that's when you get somewhere.
Do you wear a watch, Derek?
Used to, but the band broke.
Does that look familiar to you? Go ahead, open it up.
Now he's rattled. He's looking at that buckle and his mind is racing. Where'd you get that?
Because this, we found in your room. And that, we found stuck in a fence behind Curtis Ashley's apartment. We're looking to you for this murder.
I said, Derek, you know where this is going. You're going to jail. Maybe for a very long time. He drops his head and starts looking at the floor. This is the moment you wait for. Surrender. Emotionally, he has surrendered. We now know that Derek and Glenn Sapp are responsible for the death of Curtis Ashley. No longer a mystery. So now we need Derek to tell us that, and he's about to.
Tell me what happened, Derek. Just say the words.
Look, I didn't know we had a gun.
Okay, that's good. Tell me how it started.
Well, we went to the carnival. We had a couple drinks.
Man, Curtis is really pissing me off, man.
Yeah?
He's owed me money for months now. Always got an excuse.
Yeah, he's total scum.
Damn right.
He gets more and more distressed, and he starts telling Derek how he can't let this go, because if he does, the word gets out there that you don't have to pay Glenn, because Curtis never paid Glenn. So he says while they're there, they're drinking, they're talking about this, they see Hannah there.
Hey, Hannah.
Hey, guys.
Hey, yourself, sweet thing.
And she's important to him. Her affections are important to him.
Do you know where Curtis is? We need to talk to him.
Yeah, I saw him earlier today.
I thought you two weren't talking.
Well,
Glenn believes that Hannah hates Curtis. Well, she doesn't. And she's playing with Glenn's emotions. She says, we're in a better place now and we're fine. And Glenn is like, what?
Look, I don't want you talking to him.
Glenn is already upset. And now Hannah shows up and pours gasoline on the flame.
hey, look, I gotta go. My kids are waiting on me.
You see you tomorrow?
Maybe.
Glenn decides they're going to go over there and confront Curtis. Derek's opinion is they're going to get the money and then Glenn's going to calm down and they're going to leave. That's what he believes is going to happen.
Let's check the front door before we try the windows.
The apartment door was unlocked, and they actually just walked in.
Who's there?
Glenn sees that there's a gun, and he immediately fires one shot. And they run. They do what fear drives you to do. They run. I believe that Derek never thought that Glenn was going to take things that far. And maybe Glenn didn't think he was either. I think the combination of the emotion, the presence of a gun in proximity to Curtis, made everybody react, and a shot is fired. One shot, not multiple shots, one.
With Derek Dieter's statement in tow, prosecutors elicit a confession from Glenn Sapp, who admits to killing Curtis Ashley over a drug debt. Though Hannah claimed Curtis abused cocaine, the autopsy report was inconclusive.
Derek was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Glenn was subsequently charged with accessory to murder, pled guilty to that, and was sentenced to 8 years in prison.
Curtis Ashley lives on this planet for 28 years, not 29, because he loses his life over a drug debt and a presumed involvement with a female. And who is Hannah? Well, Hannah is a musician. She's plucking everybody's strings and making noise, but it's not music. It was clearly Hannah's intent to stir the pot with a radioactive spoon between Glenn Sapp and Curtis Ashley. Can we charge Hannah with anything? No. Was she one of the movers in this affair? Absolutely.
The phone rang just after midnight, the kind of ring that cuts through sleep like a blade, the kind that tells you something is wrong before a single word is spoken. And on the other end of that line in Ohio, in the winter of 1992, a voice said there was a car abandoned on a county road, engine cold, driver's door open, headlights still on, pointing into a stretch of darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. And when the deputy arrived, he stood there longer than protocol allowed, staring at the empty seat, the scattered papers on the floorboard, the faint smell of gasoline and something else, something human, something unfinished. And in that moment, before the first report was written, before the word cold case ever existed for this file, the silence already felt heavier than any scream. The road cut through farmland and skeletal trees, a place locals drove without thinking, a place you didn't stop unless you had to, and the car belonged to a woman everyone in town knew by sight if not by name. The kind of person whose routines were so fixed they became invisible. Same coffee shop every morning, same shift, same route home, and that night she never arrived, never called, never left a note. She simply vanished into the gap between 2 hours on a clock, leaving behind a vehicle that looked staged, too clean, too deliberate, as if someone wanted it to be found exactly like this. Doors open, keys missing, no sign of a struggle, and yet every sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong. By sunrise, the road was lined with cruisers and unmarked cars, boots in frost, breath fogging the air as detectives walked slow circles around the scene, photographing angles, measuring distances, collecting what little there was to collect. A hair caught in the seat fabric that didn't match her color, a fingerprint smudged beyond usefulness, tire tracks overlapping tire tracks until they told no story at all. And already the rumors were starting. Because in small communities, rumors move faster than facts, and by mid-morning people were saying she had run away, or she had met someone, or she had debts no one knew about, because it is easier to believe in choice than to accept the possibility of being taken. They searched anyway, grid by grid, field by field, volunteers fanning out with thermoses and flashlights, calling her name into the cold, helicopters slicing the sky, dogs losing the scent at the edge of the road as if she had stepped into thin air. And when nothing turned up, the tone shifted, the language hardened. Missing person became suspected foul play. Suspected foul play became investigation. Investigation became pressure, because someone, somewhere, knew something, and the community began to feel that pressure like a bruise you keep pressing to see if it still hurts. Her family sat under the glare of cameras, holding photographs, answering the same questions again and again. Did she have enemies? Did she have secrets? Was there anyone she was afraid of? and every answer sounded the same. No, not that we know of. No, she was careful. No, she would never just disappear. And the detectives listened, nodded, took notes, filed them away, because in cases like this the absence of answers becomes its own kind of evidence. A void you keep circling, hoping something will eventually surface. Weeks passed, then months. Leads came in waves and crashed just as quickly. A reported sighting at a gas station that turned out to be someone else. A tip about a man with scratches on his arms that went nowhere. A confession from a drunk that collapsed under the weight of sobriety. And with every dead end the file grew thicker, heavier, harder to carry, until one day someone wrote the words "cold case" on the folder, not as a conclusion but as a concession. An acknowledgement that time, the one thing no investigation can control, was beginning to win. The town changed after that, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Doors locked earlier, parents waited longer at bus stops, strangers were noticed in a way they never had been before, and her name became shorthand for fear, for the idea that normal life could fracture without warning, and every anniversary brought fresh headlines, fresh questions, fresh pain, because unresolved cases don't fade, they linger, they rot quietly in the background, shaping behavior long after the details blur. Years later, long after some of the original detectives had retired, long after evidence standards had evolved and memories had softened, a man walked into a station in a neighboring county and said he needed to talk, and when he said her name the room changed, because names like that don't lose their power, and he spoke slowly, deliberately, telling a story that seemed to fit just enough to be dangerous, placing himself near the road that night, claiming knowledge only the killer would have, and when he finally said the word confession, it landed with a thud that echoed across decades. The headlines exploded: Ohio 1992 cold case finally solved, confession exposes decades-long lie, a narrative too perfect to resist, closure packaged for a community that had been waiting so long it almost forgot what closure was supposed to feel like, and for a moment people allowed themselves to breathe, to believe that the nightmare had an ending, that the empty space could finally be filled with answers. But beneath the surface, beneath the sound bites and the press conferences, something didn't sit right, and the more you listened, the more the story began to fray. Details shifted between interviews, timelines bent under scrutiny, facts that should have been locked in place moved just enough to raise eyebrows, and when investigators went back to the old evidence with new eyes, new technology, they found inconsistencies that refused to align, fibers that didn't match his account, locations he described that contradicted cell tower data that didn't exist in 1992 but spoke clearly now, and suddenly the word "finally" in those headlines felt premature, almost reckless. The family listened to the confession in a small room, hands clasped, hearts racing, wanting to believe and yet bracing for disappointment, because hope, after years of waiting, becomes a fragile thing, easily shattered, and when they asked questions he couldn't answer, when they pointed out details he had missed, the room grew quiet again. That same heavy silence from the roadside all those years ago, creeping back in, reminding everyone that lies can masquerade as truth when the truth has been absent for too long. Prosecutors weighed the risks, detectives argued late into the night, some convinced this was it, others certain they were being handed another false ending, and outside the station cameras waited, hungry for resolution, for a clean line to draw under a messy story. But cold cases rarely offer clean lines. They offer shadows, half-answers, and the uncomfortable realization that time doesn't just erode memories, it creates opportunities for manipulation. As the confession was dissected piece by piece, another possibility emerged, darker and more unsettling. That this man wasn't revealing the truth but exploiting the void left by it, stepping into a narrative shaped by years of speculation, rumors, and leaked details, crafting a lie convincing enough to pass as closure. And if that was true, then the case wasn't finally solved at all. It was being buried under something just as dangerous as silence, a false certainty. And so the community found itself back where it started, suspended between relief and doubt, between wanting to move on and fearing the cost of doing so too quickly. Because if this confession was a lie, then the real story was still out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice the detail everyone else missed. And as the headlines faded and the cameras moved on, the cold case remained what it had always been, an open wound disguised as a scar, a question mark carved into the history of a town that learned too late that some nights never really end. The confession did not close the file, it cracked it open wider, because once doubt enters a narrative it spreads fast, seeping into every detail that once felt solid, and detectives who had spent years trying to forget this case found themselves pulled back in. Late nights under fluorescent lights, old photographs spread across metal tables, listening again to recordings that now sounded different, pauses longer than remembered, emphasis landing on the wrong words. The cadence of a man who knew how to sound convincing without ever quite sounding true. They went back to the road, not physically at first but on paper, maps marked with pencil lines tracing where the car was found, where the dogs lost the scent, where volunteers had searched and where they had not, and it became clear that this was never just a point on a map, it was a boundary, a place where certainty stopped, because nothing beyond that line had ever been proven, only assumed, and assumptions are the enemy of cold cases. They harden into facts if left unchallenged long enough. The man who confessed said he had offered her a ride, said she trusted him, said it all happened quickly, too quickly to leave marks, too quickly for witnesses, and on the surface it explained the absence of chaos at the scene. But when they compared his story to the weather reports from that night, the temperature, the wind, the timing of frost settling on the car, cracks appeared, small at first, then undeniable, because truth is consistent even decades later, and lies require constant adjustment. Witnesses from 1992 were contacted again, voices older now, memories frayed, but some things had stuck, a truck seen idling near the road, a light moving through the trees, a sound that didn't belong to the night, dismissed at the time because it didn't fit any theory investigators were ready to commit to, and those statements, once footnotes, now felt like clues waiting patiently for attention, as if the case itself had been holding its breath. The community watched all of this from a distance, headlines quieter now, less triumphant, tinged with skepticism, because nothing unsettles people like the realization that closure might have been a mirage, and talk returned to coffee shops and backyards, the old theories resurfacing, the neighbor who moved away suddenly, the coworker who asked too many questions afterward, the local rumor everyone pretended not to believe but never forgot. And in those conversations you could hear the fatigue, the way years of uncertainty wear people down until even hope feels like a risk. Investigators dug into the man's past, not just criminal records but patterns, moments where attention followed him, other stories where he inserted himself into tragedy, offering help, offering information, offering confessions that never quite held up, and this pattern, once noticed, was impossible to ignore, because false confessions don't come from nowhere, they come from a need, for relevance, for absolution, for control over a narrative that was never theirs. At the same time, new technology breathed life into old evidence. Fibers analyzed with tools that didn't exist in 1992, trace materials re-examined, databases cross-checked, and while nothing pointed cleanly to a suspect, it pointed away from the confession with increasing confidence, an absence that spoke louder than any admission, because if this man had done what he claimed, the evidence should have whispered his name at least once, and it never did. The family felt the shift immediately, the way officials spoke more carefully, the way promises softened into possibilities, and that shift hurt more than the years of silence, because it reopened wounds they had tried to cauterize with belief, and now they were back in limbo, forced to question not only who took her but who had tried to take the truth from them, and in private moments they wondered which was worse. Files were reopened officially, a move that sounded proactive but carried its own admission of failure, that the case had never truly been understood, that something fundamental had been missed, and that acknowledgement rippled outward, because every cold case reopened sends a message, that time does not guarantee answers, and that justice delayed is not just justice denied, it is justice distorted by years of narrative drift. Detectives interviewed people who had once been cleared, not because new evidence implicated them but because old logic no longer held, and those conversations were tense, defensive, sometimes hostile, because being revisited after decades carries an accusation all its own, and some reacted with anger while others reacted with fear, and both reactions were noted, filed away, added to a growing web that refused to resolve into a single shape. One name surfaced more than once, not loudly, not definitively, but persistently, someone connected loosely to the area, someone who had knowledge of the road, the schedules, the habits, someone whose alibi had relied on another person's word, and when that word was traced back it dissolved into uncertainty, a chain of assumptions stretching back to a time when investigators needed to move on, needed to close doors even if the locks were faulty. As this alternative thread developed, the confession began to look less like a solution and more like an obstruction, a layer of noise that had distracted from quieter signals, and that realization was infuriating to those who had championed it publicly, because admitting error carries consequences, reputations, careers, trust, and the system does not reward those who say they were wrong, even when being wrong has real victims. The man recanted parts of his story under pressure, then reaffirmed them, then changed details again, a pattern that only deepened suspicion, and prosecutors hesitated, knowing that taking this to trial could collapse spectacularly, leaving the case weaker than before, and so it stalled, suspended in a legal gray zone where nothing moves forward and nothing is truly abandoned. Outside, the town marked another anniversary. Candles on the roadside, names spoken softly, a ritual that had become routine, and standing there you could feel the weight of unanswered questions pressing down, because unresolved crimes don't stay in the past. They become part of the present, shaping how people see each other, how they interpret silence, how they react to strangers, and even now, decades later, parents still told their children to be careful on that stretch of road, without fully explaining why. Investigators faced a choice that every cold case eventually demands: pursue the easiest narrative or the most honest one, and honesty here meant admitting that the confession might be nothing more than a decades-long lie layered on top of an older, deeper mystery, and that solving the case would require dismantling not just a story but the comfort it briefly provided. And so the file remained open, thicker than ever, heavier with the weight of false hope, real grief, and the uncomfortable knowledge that the truth, whatever it is, has survived this long by staying just out of reach. Hidden not by darkness but by the very human desire to believe that every story ends neatly, because as long as that desire exists, there will always be someone willing to exploit it, and somewhere, beneath the noise, a real answer waiting to be heard. As the investigation pushed forward again, it did so under a different kind of pressure, quieter but heavier, because this time there was no illusion of novelty, no excitement of discovery, only the grinding awareness that every step taken now should have been taken decades earlier, and that whatever truth remained had learned how to hide in the blind spots created by time, bureaucracy, and human error. The case file grew not just in volume but in complexity, layers of interpretation stacked on top of raw facts until separating one from the other became its own challenge, and detectives found themselves asking not only what happened, but when the story first began to drift away from reality. They reconstructed the original timeline hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute, not trusting summaries written in 1992, not trusting conclusions drawn under different standards, reading handwritten notes with the skepticism of people who knew how easily certainty could be manufactured. The night she vanished was replayed again and again, her last confirmed sighting, the purchase she made, the receipt time-stamped with mechanical indifference, the cashier who remembered nothing unusual except that she seemed tired, distracted, like someone eager to get home. Small details, ordinary details, but in cold cases, ordinary is often where the truth hides, because it is overlooked in favor of drama. The abandoned car became a focal point again, not just where it was found but how it was positioned, the angle of the wheels, the way the door was left open just enough to suggest interruption rather than haste, and forensic analysts debated whether this was the result of panic or planning, because those two things leave very different signatures. Panic is messy, inconsistent, driven by fear. Planning is quiet, controlled, confident. The scene leaned toward the latter, and that realization shifted the tone of the investigation from opportunistic violence to something more deliberate, more personal. That shift forced detectives to reconsider relationships that had once been dismissed as benign, people who knew her routines not because they stalked her, but because routines are visible to anyone paying attention long enough. Co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances from places she frequented without thinking. Each name carried a different weight now, and interviews that once felt redundant took on new urgency. Some people were cooperative, eager to help, relieved to talk. Others were guarded, defensive, bristling at questions they believed they had already answered, and the difference between those reactions was noted, not as proof, but as texture, something to be understood rather than judged. The man who confessed faded into the background of the investigation, no longer central but not entirely dismissed either, because even false confessions can carry accidental truths, borrowed details, fragments overheard and repurposed, and analysts combed through his statements looking for information he should not have known, anything that could tie him indirectly to the real events. They found references that matched public knowledge and rumors circulated over the years, but nothing that pierced the veil of plausibility, nothing that could anchor his words to physical reality, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he was reduced from solution to symptom, evidence not of guilt but of how badly people wanted this story to end. Meanwhile, the alternative thread grew more distinct, not because it offered clarity, but because it refused to disappear. The name that kept resurfacing belonged to someone who had lived close enough to know, worked close enough to observe, and moved away not long after the disappearance, a fact that once meant little but now felt significant in its timing. His alibi had been accepted without scrutiny, backed by someone whose own memory had softened over time, and when investigators attempted to reconstruct that alibi using independent data, they found gaps large enough to drive doubt through, moments unaccounted for, assumptions mistaken for verification. Reaching out to this individual after so many years was a delicate operation, not least because of the legal and ethical boundaries that time imposes. He agreed to speak, calm on the surface, cooperative in tone, recounting his version of events with a confidence that bordered on rehearsed, and yet something in his delivery felt off to those trained to listen, a subtle mismatch between detail and emotion, between what was said and what was avoided. He remembered certain moments vividly while glossing over others that should have been memorable, and that selective clarity raised questions that lingered long after the interview ended. Physical evidence offered little help here, because whatever traces once existed had been degraded, lost, or rendered ambiguous by the passage of years, and this is where cold cases become most frustrating, trapped between what can be proven and what can be reasonably inferred. Still, analysts noticed patterns, not in fibers or fingerprints, but in behavior, movements, opportunities, the quiet choreography of daily life that can place someone at the center of an event without leaving marks behind. This was not a case that would be solved by a single breakthrough, if it was to be solved at all, but by the accumulation of small truths aligning just enough to point in one direction. The family followed these developments with a mixture of hope and exhaustion, learning to read between the lines of official statements, sensing when progress was real and when it was performative. They had lived with ambiguity for so long that certainty, even the promise of it, felt foreign, almost dangerous, and they guarded themselves against disappointment by expecting it. Every phone call from investigators carried weight, every pause heavy with implication, and yet they listened because not listening was never an option. Media interest flared and faded in cycles, reignited by rumors, extinguished by the lack of definitive answers, and with each cycle the story changed slightly, shaped by whoever was telling it. Some narratives painted her as unlucky, others as reckless, subtle shifts that mattered deeply to those who knew her, because how a victim is remembered influences how justice is pursued. Detectives pushed back against those distortions when they could, but they were fighting not just misinformation, but time itself, and time is a formidable adversary. Internally, disagreements emerged within the investigative team, debates over priorities, resources, and the ethics of pursuing leads that might never produce courtroom-ready evidence. Some argued that the goal should be resolution, even if imperfect, a name, a story that made sense. Others insisted that anything short of verifiable truth was another betrayal, another lie layered onto the past. These debates were intense, personal, reflective of a broader tension within the justice system about what solving a case truly means. As months passed without a decisive turn, the case settled into a familiar rhythm of slow progress and sudden setbacks, a reminder that reopening a cold case does not guarantee warmth, only motion. Yet something had undeniably changed, not in the evidence, but in the collective mindset, an acceptance that the old conclusions were insufficient, that the confession had been a distraction, and that the real story was likely quieter, less sensational, hidden in the overlooked spaces between routine and opportunity. And in those spaces, detectives continued to search, aware that every unanswered question was not just a failure of investigation, but a fracture in the community's sense of safety, because unresolved violence leaves behind more than grief. It leaves behind vigilance, suspicion, and the enduring fear that what happened once could happen again, and that fear, more than any headline, was the true legacy of the Ohio 1992 cold case. Still unresolved, still watching, still waiting for someone to finally see it clearly. Time in reopened cases does not move forward, it folds back on itself, pulling investigators into moments that were never properly examined, and one of those moments now demanded attention, the hours before she disappeared, not as a checklist of actions but as a psychological landscape, because people don't vanish randomly, they vanish at points of transition, when something shifts just enough to expose vulnerability. Detectives began to treat that day not as ordinary but as charged, listening again to the people who had crossed her path. Not for facts alone but for tone, hesitation, the emotional residue left behind when memory brushes against something unresolved. A coworker remembered an argument, minor at the time, forgotten almost immediately, about a schedule change, about someone waiting for her after work. A detail dismissed in 1992 because it seemed trivial, because nothing else supported it, but now it resurfaced with weight, because cold cases teach you that trivial details are only trivial until they aren't. That coworker could not remember the name, only the implication, that she had somewhere to be, something to manage before going home, and that implication lingered like smoke. Another person recalled seeing her in the parking lot, standing by her car longer than usual, not distressed, not exactly calm either, as if deciding whether to get in or wait, and when pressed, the witness admitted they had assumed she was on the phone, though they never actually saw one. Assumptions again, layered on top of reality, and detectives marked it down because assumptions have a way of replacing observation when memory is stretched thin. They began mapping social connections with renewed precision, not just who knew her, but who intersected with her routines at just the right angles, people whose presence would not have raised alarm, whose approach would not have triggered fear. This was not a crime of chaos, they were increasingly convinced, but of access, and access narrows the field in ways that brute force never can. Someone had been close enough to be trusted, or at least close enough to be ignored. The alternative suspect's name surfaced again in this context, quietly but persistently, tied to places she frequented, to schedules that overlapped, to moments that could plausibly place him in her orbit without anyone noticing. Investigators reconstructed his movements that day using fragments, a receipt here, a remembered errand there, gaps filled not with certainty but with probability, and probability, while not evidence, can guide attention. What troubled them was not what they could place, but what they couldn't rule out. When questioned about that day again, decades later, his answers were smooth, practiced, consistent with his earlier statements, and consistency, while often a marker of truth, can also be rehearsed, especially when a story has been told enough times to harden. He expressed sympathy, even frustration, about the case's persistence, questioned why it was being reopened now, after so long, and that question itself carried a subtle defensiveness, as if time should have granted immunity, as if survival equaled innocence. Investigators noticed something else, too, a pattern of proximity to other incidents, none of them criminal on their own, but together forming a constellation of behavior that felt familiar to those who study violent crime, the tendency to insert oneself near vulnerability, to linger at edges, to know more than necessary. It was not enough to accuse, not enough to charge, but it was enough to keep watching, enough to keep listening, because cold cases rarely announce their answers, they whisper them. The confession that once dominated headlines now felt distant, almost irrelevant, but its impact lingered in subtler ways, because it had altered expectations, had taught the public to anticipate resolution, and now that expectation hovered over the investigation like a deadline no one could meet. Pressure mounted quietly, not from superiors but from the awareness that each renewed effort raised hope again, and hope, when disappointed repeatedly, can turn corrosive. The family wrestled with that reality daily, torn between wanting progress and fearing its cost, because every new lead reopened emotional ground they had tried to stabilize. They remembered her not as a victim but as a presence, a voice, a set of habits that once filled space and now existed only in memory, and watching the investigation circle endlessly without landing felt like losing her over and over again, each time in a different way. Detectives tried to shield them from speculation when possible, but speculation was inevitable, especially as journalists began revisiting old angles, reframing narratives, some responsibly, others less so, and with each article the story shifted slightly, emphasizing drama over nuance, certainty over doubt. The term cold case became a hook, a promise of eventual revelation, even when reality offered no such guarantee. Inside the task force, the mood oscillated between determination and resignation, fueled by the understanding that solving this case would likely not come from a single decisive act but from persistence bordering on obsession. They reviewed similar cases from the era, looking for patterns, overlaps, methods that might connect disparate events into a recognizable shape, but nothing aligned cleanly enough to claim a link, and that absence of pattern was itself unsettling, suggesting either a unique act or one carefully designed to appear so. They revisited the search areas, not physically but through modern modeling, terrain analysis, decay studies, asking uncomfortable questions about whether something had been missed, whether assumptions about where to look had been flawed from the start. The idea that answers might still lie undiscovered, not hidden but overlooked, was both hopeful and damning, a reminder that thoroughness is often judged only in hindsight. As these efforts continued, the alternative suspect's life trajectory was examined in greater detail. Moves, job changes, relationships formed and broken, moments of instability that coincided with key dates in the investigation. None of it proved anything, but patterns of stress and displacement can sometimes illuminate motive, opportunity, or aftermath, and investigators followed those threads carefully, aware that overinterpretation can be as misleading as neglect. At the same time, internal reviews raised uncomfortable questions about the original investigation. Decisions made under pressure, shortcuts taken, leads dismissed, not out of malice but out of necessity, resource limits, human fatigue. Acknowledging those shortcomings was painful but necessary, because without confronting past errors, present efforts risked repeating them. The road where the car was found remained unchanged, still quiet, still ordinary, a place drivers passed without slowing, unaware of the history embedded in its asphalt. For investigators, it had become symbolic, not of the crime itself but of the moment when control was lost, when the narrative slipped away and was never fully recovered. Standing there in photographs and maps, it felt less like a location and more like a question, one that refused to be answered easily. As weeks turned into months again, the investigation reached another familiar plateau, active but unresolved, informed but uncertain, and yet there was a sense that something irreversible had occurred, that the case could no longer retreat into silence, because too many assumptions had been challenged, too many possibilities reopened. The story had been destabilized, and while that did not guarantee truth, it made complacency impossible. The Ohio 1992 cold case remained officially open, its status unchanged, its future unclear, but beneath that administrative label was a deeper reality, that the lie exposed by the confession had forced a reckoning, not just with one false narrative, but with the comfort of believing that time alone delivers answers. And in that reckoning, the case continued to live, unresolved, persistent, a reminder that some mysteries endure not because they are unsolvable, but because the path to solving them demands a level of patience, humility, and honesty that few systems are built to sustain. The longer the case stayed open, the more it began to behave like a living thing, adapting to attention, resisting it, revealing just enough to keep pursuit alive, and investigators learned to respect that rhythm, to stop forcing conclusions and start listening for what the evidence had been trying to say all along. One of the most unsettling realizations emerged quietly, almost accidentally, during a routine review of early search logs, the acknowledgement that the initial response, though swift, had been narrowly focused, guided by assumptions about distance, visibility, and probability that may never have applied. In 1992, the prevailing belief was simple. If she had been taken from that road, the perpetrator would not have gone far, not with search parties mobilizing, not with the risk of being seen. That belief shaped where people looked and, more importantly, where they did not. Areas deemed too inconvenient, too exposed, or too improbable were deprioritized, and over time those decisions hardened into invisible borders, lines no one crossed again because they had already been crossed once and found wanting. Modern analysts question those borders, not out of arrogance but out of understanding that behavior under stress rarely follows clean logic. They modeled alternative scenarios, routes that would have seemed risky but offered speed, concealment, or familiarity, paths someone with local knowledge could navigate instinctively. When those models were overlaid with property records, land use data, and historical access points, new areas of interest appeared, not dramatically but insistently, places that had been overlooked not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient to imagine. The idea that her remains might never have been found not because they were expertly hidden, but because no one had looked in the right way, in the right place, settled heavily on the team. It reframed the entire investigation, shifting the question from who confessed falsely to who benefited most from the original blind spots. And blind spots, once identified, have a way of pointing back toward those who helped create them, intentionally or not. Attention returned to individuals who had been present during the early days of the search, people who volunteered information freely, guided others through terrain, suggested where to look and where not to bother. This was delicate territory, because volunteers are the lifeblood of community response, and suspicion cast too broadly can erode trust. Still, patterns emerged, subtle but persistent, moments where guidance aligned too neatly with misdirection, where confidence replaced curiosity, and those moments were flagged, not as accusations, but as anomalies. One name, again, intersected with these observations, the same individual whose proximity had troubled investigators before. Records showed he had assisted in coordinating certain aspects of the search, offering local knowledge, pointing out obstacles, advising on access routes. At the time, this had been welcomed, even appreciated. Now, decades later, it looked different, not incriminating on its own, but influential in ways that were no longer comfortable to ignore. When questioned about this involvement, he framed it as civic duty, a desire to help, a response anyone might have had under the circumstances. And that was true. Many people had stepped forward in those days. The difference lay in persistence, in how deeply he remained embedded, how his suggestions shaped decisions, how his voice carried weight disproportionate to his role. Investigators noted that influence not as proof of wrongdoing, but as a factor that could no longer be dismissed. At the same time, behavioral analysts were brought in to review the broader arc of the case, not to profile a killer in the abstract, but to understand the dynamics at play, the choices made by both perpetrator and investigators. They spoke about control, about crimes designed to create minimal noise, maximum ambiguity, acts that exploit routine and trust rather than force. In that framework, the abandoned car was not a mistake or an afterthought, but a message, subtle, intentional, designed to suggest spontaneity while concealing preparation. This interpretation cast the entire scene in a new light, the open door not as evidence of interruption, but as theater, the lack of struggle not as mercy, but as strategy. If true, it meant the person responsible had thought beyond the act itself, had anticipated investigation, had understood how narratives form and how easily they can be nudged. And that understanding narrowed the psychological field considerably. Investigators revisited statements made in the immediate aftermath, listening for confidence that exceeded reason, for predictions that proved accurate without explanation, for emotional responses that felt misaligned with the uncertainty of the moment. Most statements were unremarkable, colored by shock and confusion. A few stood out not for what they said, but for what they assumed, conclusions drawn too quickly, certainty where none should have existed. One such statement, buried deep in early transcripts, described the likelihood that she had left voluntarily, a claim made before evidence supported it, a claim that had influenced media coverage and, indirectly, investigative direction. The source of that claim was traced back through layers of reporting until it landed, again on a familiar name. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore, not because it screamed guilt, but because it whispered intent. The confession, once so disruptive, now seemed almost trivial by comparison, a loud distraction from quieter manipulations that had shaped the case from its inception. Whether the confessor knew this or not was unclear, but his role had become that of a decoy, intentional or otherwise, absorbing attention that might otherwise have settled on more complex truths. In that sense, the decades-long lie referenced in headlines felt misdirected, because the lie was not singular, it was cumulative, built from small distortions accepted over time. The family was informed cautiously of these developments, not with promises, but with transparency, an acknowledgement that the case was being understood differently now, that earlier assumptions were under review. They listened, processing the information with a calm born of long endurance, asking questions that cut to the heart of the matter, not who might have done this, but why it had taken so long to ask the right questions. Their trust in the process was fragile, but not gone, sustained by the sense that this time, the investigation was less concerned with resolution and more concerned with truth, however incomplete. That distinction mattered deeply, because they had learned the cost of premature answers, the pain of believing something only to have it unravel later. If the case was to end without certainty, they wanted it to do so honestly. As summer approached, search efforts were quietly reconsidered, not announced, not dramatized, but planned with care, guided by modern analysis and informed by old mistakes. The possibility of finding something, anything, after all these years was slim, but not impossible, and investigators weighed the emotional impact of renewed searches against the potential for discovery. In cold cases, action is always a gamble because doing nothing preserves the status quo, while doing something risks reopening wounds. They chose to proceed carefully, methodically, targeting areas that had never been examined with current understanding, places that sat just outside the original perimeter, overlooked because they defied easy categorization. The hope was not necessarily to find remains, but to find confirmation, evidence that could anchor theories in physical reality, that could transform inference into fact. Throughout this renewed effort, the sense persisted that the truth was not hidden by sophistication, but by familiarity, by the tendency to overlook what feels known. The Ohio 1992 cold case had survived not because it was impenetrable, but because it had been framed too narrowly, constrained by early narratives that shaped every subsequent decision. Now, as those narratives cracked, the case breathed differently, not solved, not close to solved, but finally free of some of the weight that had held it in place. And yet, even as new ground was broken, both literally and figuratively, there was an awareness that answers, if they came, would likely be partial, fragmented, arriving without the clarity people crave. Cold cases rarely end with revelation. They end with understanding, an acceptance of what can be known and what must remain uncertain. As investigators prepared for the next phase, that understanding guided them, a quiet resolve to pursue the truth not because it promised closure, but because leaving the lie intact was no longer an option. The renewed searches began without fanfare, no cameras, no press releases, just unmarked vehicles pulling off familiar roads at unfamiliar points. Investigators stepping into terrain that had always been considered peripheral, too awkward, too exposed, too unlikely to hold answers. The choice to stay quiet was intentional, born from hard lessons about attention, about how spectacle can contaminate evidence and distort motive, and so the work unfolded slowly, deliberately, under the radar of a community that had learned to read headlines but not silence. They moved with maps that looked nothing like the ones from 1992, layered with satellite data, elevation models, historical land use, and reconstructed sightlines that revealed how differently the same ground could be perceived depending on where you stood. What had once seemed open now appeared concealed from key angles. What had once seemed inaccessible revealed forgotten paths. Service roads erased from memory but not from records. The land, like the case itself, had been misread. Teams documented everything: soil composition, drainage patterns, disturbances that could not be explained by agriculture or erosion alone. Most of what they found led nowhere, and they accepted that without frustration, because cold cases punish impatience. But occasionally something forced them to stop, to kneel, to look closer, a fragment of fabric degraded beyond identification, a depression in the ground inconsistent with natural settling, anomalies that could be nothing or could be everything. Each potential find triggered a careful chain of verification. Specialists consulted, samples taken, tested, often returning inconclusive results that nonetheless added texture to the evolving picture. The absence of definitive evidence did not halt progress. Instead, it sharpened focus, narrowing attention to areas where multiple factors overlapped: proximity to routes, concealment, accessibility at night, familiarity to someone who lived and moved through the area without drawing attention. Parallel to the fieldwork, investigators revisited the alternative suspects' movements with new urgency. The renewed searches had geographic implications, and when those locations were overlaid with his known routines, overlaps emerged that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. He had reason to be near those areas, reasons that sounded plausible on their own: errands, shortcuts, habits, but plausibility does not equal innocence, especially when it repeats. When confronted with these overlaps, he reacted subtly but noticeably: a tightening of language, a shift toward generalities, references to memory loss when specifics were requested. None of this was dramatic, none of it actionable in a legal sense, but detectives trained themselves to notice such shifts, because they often mark the boundary between comfort and exposure. He was not panicked, but he was alert, suddenly aware that the narrative he had relied on for decades was no longer holding. The confession, now almost an afterthought, resurfaced briefly when the confessor attempted to reinsert himself, offering additional details, adjusting timelines, claiming newfound clarity. Investigators listened, documented, and quietly set his statements aside, recognizing the pattern for what it was, an attempt to reclaim relevance in a story that was moving on without him. His words no longer carried weight because weight belongs to consistency, and consistency had abandoned him long ago. The family was informed that searches were underway, carefully, gently, without promises. They responded with a mixture of gratitude and dread, because renewed effort carries the implicit possibility of discovery, and discovery, in cases like this, is rarely gentle. Still, they supported the work, understanding that unanswered questions had already exacted their toll, and that truth, however painful, was preferable to perpetual uncertainty. As weeks passed, small findings accumulated, not enough to announce, but enough to reinforce direction. Investigators noted that areas now under scrutiny shared a common feature: proximity to spaces controlled or frequented by a narrow group of people. Individuals whose access was normal enough to avoid notice, whose presence would not have raised alarm. This reinforced the emerging belief that the crime was not an aberration, but an exploitation of normalcy. Behavioral analysts weighed in again, pointing out that such crimes often rely on community trust, on the assumption that danger comes from outside rather than within. The offender does not need to overpower. They need only to be familiar, to be unthreatening, to be part of the background. In that context, the early insistence that she had left voluntarily took on new meaning, not as speculation, but as misdirection that benefited someone who understood how narratives protect the familiar. Investigators reviewed media coverage from the early days, tracking how language evolved, how certain phrases appeared and reappeared, shaping perception. They noted how quickly the idea of a voluntary disappearance took hold, how it softened urgency, redirected focus, allowed time to pass. This was not proof of orchestration, but it was evidence of influence, and influence, when examined closely, often leaves fingerprints of its own. Internally, discussions turned toward strategy, not just how to pursue the case, but how to avoid repeating old mistakes. There was agreement that charging without certainty would be catastrophic, both legally and ethically, and so the focus remained on building a foundation strong enough to withstand scrutiny, even if that meant moving slower than the public might want. The goal was not to win headlines, but to withstand time, because time had already proven itself to be the case's greatest adversary. The alternative suspects' associates were interviewed, not aggressively, but persistently, conversations framed around routine, around the ordinary details people recall without feeling threatened. Some offered nothing of note. Others hesitated, corrected themselves, expressed uncertainty about memories they had once described confidently, and those moments were catalogued, not as accusations, but as indicators that the story surrounding this individual was less stable than it appeared. As autumn approached, the searches concluded quietly, leaving behind more questions than answers, but also a clearer sense of where the truth was not. That narrowing mattered because cold cases are solved as much by elimination as by discovery, by ruling out false paths until only the uncomfortable ones remain. The investigation had crossed a threshold, from speculative to focused, from reactive to deliberate. The town, largely unaware of these developments, continued its routines, passing the same roads, the same fields, unaware that the past was being excavated beneath the surface of their daily lives. That disconnect was striking to investigators, the way unresolved violence can coexist with normalcy, the way a community can adapt around absence until it becomes invisible. Yet absence has weight, and that weight pressed on everyone involved, especially as the realization set in that answers, if they came, would likely implicate someone who had never truly left, someone woven into the fabric of the place. That possibility was the most unsettling of all, because it meant the threat had never been external, never fleeting, but embedded, tolerated, perhaps even trusted. As the case moved forward, stripped now of false confessions and premature conclusions, it entered its most dangerous phase, the point at which suspicion narrows and stakes rise, where truth, long protected by familiarity and time, begins to feel exposed. And in that exposure, the Ohio 1992 cold case revealed its most chilling implication, that solving it would not just rewrite history, but force a reckoning with how easily a lie can live unquestioned, when it wears the face of the ordinary. As suspicion narrowed, the investigation grew quieter, more careful, because this was the phase where cases either crystallize or collapse, and everyone involved understood the stakes. When attention concentrates on familiar ground, on people who have lived unchallenged for years, the margin for error disappears. Detectives slowed their pace deliberately, choosing depth over speed, revisiting not just actions but patterns, not just timelines but relationships, because guilt, when hidden long enough, tends to reveal itself not through one mistake, but through a lifetime of small, consistent choices. They began charting the alternative suspect's life alongside the case itself, not looking for a single explosive overlap, but for resonance, moments where his trajectory seemed to bend in response to key developments. Job changes that coincided with investigative surges, relocations that followed renewed attention, periods of withdrawal when the case was quiet, then sudden visibility when narratives shifted. None of this proved anything in isolation, but together it formed a rhythm that felt reactive, as if his life had been unconsciously calibrated around the unresolved crime. Financial records from the early 90s were examined where possible, limited by time and availability, but even fragments told stories, unexplained gaps, short-term loans, abrupt expenditures that did not align neatly with income. Investigators were careful not to overinterpret, aware that financial instability is common and not inherently criminal, yet they noted how these fluctuations clustered around the months following her disappearance, a period when stress, fear, or guilt could plausibly manifest in practical ways. Interviews with people who had known him casually revealed something else, a tendency toward storytelling, toward shaping events with confidence even when details were uncertain, a trait that once seemed harmless, even charismatic, but now took on a different hue. Those stories often placed him at the center of moments of crisis, not as a perpetrator, but as a witness, a helper, someone who knew what had happened when others did not. This positioning, subtle but repeated, echoed patterns familiar to investigators who had seen how some offenders manage proximity to their own secrets. At the same time, investigators revisited her life with equal intensity, determined not to let the narrative tilt toward suspicion without grounding it in victimology. They examined her habits, her boundaries, her instincts, looking for signs of caution, of trust, of resistance. Friends described her as polite but guarded, routine-oriented, unlikely to accept help from strangers, more likely to respond to someone she recognized, someone whose presence would not trigger alarm. That insight narrowed the window further, reinforcing the belief that access, not force, had been the key. The abandoned car remained a silent witness in all of this, its stillness echoing through every discussion. Analysts reconsidered the decision to leave it where it was, recognizing that abandoning a vehicle carries risk unless the person responsible understands response times, search behavior, and human curiosity. This was not a desperate act, they concluded, but a calculated one, designed to anchor the narrative to a specific location while drawing attention away from the true path taken afterward. It was misdirection executed with confidence. That confidence suggested familiarity not just with the area, but with the community's rhythms, when roads were busy, when they were empty, who noticed what and who did not. Investigators overlaid this understanding onto the suspect pool and found, again, that it narrowed toward individuals embedded in local routines, people whose movements blended seamlessly into the background. Outsiders stood out. Insiders disappeared. The family sensed the shift even before it was articulated. The way conversations became more cautious, more measured, the way names were avoided rather than floated. They understood what that meant, that the investigation was approaching something fragile, potentially explosive, and they prepared themselves for outcomes they had long feared, not just that justice might never come, but that when it did, it might implicate someone they once trusted, someone whose face they recognized from old memories of ordinary days. Legal advisors were consulted more frequently now, not to rush charges, but to ensure that every step taken could withstand scrutiny. The team knew that any case built on decades-old evidence would be attacked relentlessly, and that suspicion alone, however compelling, was not enough. They needed corroboration, independent threads that could converge without relying on interpretation. That requirement slowed progress, but it also disciplined it, forcing investigators to distinguish between what felt right and what could be proven. One such thread emerged unexpectedly from a review of old correspondence, letters sent to the family in the years following the disappearance, some sympathetic, others strange, intrusive, fixated. Most were anonymous, discarded after cursory review, but one, overlooked at the time, now drew attention for its specificity, references to locations and circumstances that had not been public knowledge. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but the language echoed phrases used by the alternative suspect in other contexts, turns of phrase distinctive enough to warrant further examination. Tracking the origin of that letter proved difficult, records incomplete, postmarks faded, but even its existence reinforced a troubling idea that someone close to the case had been watching, waiting, engaging from a distance while maintaining plausible deniability. This behavior aligned with the broader pattern investigators were seeing, a need to stay connected without stepping fully into the light, to influence without being seen. As these threads accumulated, the investigation reached a point of no return, where the comfort of ambiguity gave way to the discomfort of focus. Detectives felt it in their conversations, the way hypotheticals gave way to statements, the way discussions shifted from if to how. They were careful to police their own assumptions, to challenge each other relentlessly, because at this stage, confirmation bias is the greatest threat, and they could not afford to be wrong. The confession that once promised resolution now seemed almost grotesque in retrospect, a crude attempt to impose finality on a story that demanded patience. Its collapse had been painful, but necessary, stripping away an easy answer to reveal a more complex, more disturbing reality. The lie had not just delayed justice, it had obscured the true contours of the crime, allowing the ordinary to masquerade as harmless. Outside the investigation, life went on, birthdays, holidays, routines repeated year after year, and that contrast weighed heavily on those working the case. The knowledge that while time had marched forward for everyone else, it had stalled permanently at that winter night in 1992. Solving the case would not restore what was lost, but it could reintroduce honesty into a narrative long distorted by convenience and fear. As winter approached again, mirroring the season of her disappearance, the team prepared for the next phase, one that would require confronting the possibility that the truth, when spoken aloud, would fracture relationships, reputations, and the community's sense of itself. They understood that this was the cost of uncovering crimes rooted in familiarity, that justice, when delayed, does not arrive gently. And in that understanding, the Ohio 1992 cold case hovered on the edge of revelation, not because a single piece of evidence had emerged, but because the accumulation of patterns, behaviors, and long-ignored details had finally begun to point somewhere specific. Whether that point could be transformed into proof remained uncertain, but uncertainty no longer meant stagnation. It meant tension, the kind that builds quietly before something gives, and everyone involved could feel it, the sense that the story, after decades of silence and misdirection, was finally leaning toward the truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be. Winter returned with a familiarity that felt almost cruel, the same gray skies, the same brittle air, the same roads darkening early, and for investigators the season carried a psychological weight heavier than any file, because it mirrored the moment everything had stopped. Working the case now felt like walking backward through time, each step closer to the present revealing how much had been shaped by what was never resolved. The question was no longer whether the truth existed, but whether it could survive exposure after being buried so long beneath routine and denial. Attention turned toward pressure, not physical pressure, but narrative pressure, the kind that forces hidden inconsistencies to surface. Investigators began a series of strategic interviews, not interrogations, but conversations designed to test stability, to see how stories held up when approached from unexpected angles. The alternative suspect was contacted again, this time without confrontation, without accusation, simply with new questions framed as clarification, and the effect was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. He corrected investigators before they finished speaking, anticipated questions that had not yet been asked, filled silence with explanation rather than allowing it to sit. These were not confessions, not slips dramatic enough to seize upon, but they were tells, indicators of cognitive load, the strain of maintaining a narrative under shifting conditions. When confronted with neutral facts that contradicted earlier statements, he adjusted smoothly, too smoothly, as if recalculating rather than remembering. Investigators noted how often he referenced the passage of time, how memory fades, how details blur, a common defense, but one applied selectively. Certain moments remained vivid for him, anchored, emotionally intact, while others dissolved conveniently into vagueness. This asymmetry was recorded carefully, because memory does not degrade evenly, and selective clarity often signals emotional relevance rather than accuracy. Parallel interviews with others from his orbit produced a quieter but equally telling effect. Some expressed surprise at being contacted again, others irritation, but a few displayed something closer to anxiety, asking what had prompted the renewed interest, whether something new had been found. That question, repeated across different conversations, suggested an awareness that went beyond casual curiosity, a sense that the past was not as settled as it appeared. Investigators also revisited the early days after the disappearance, focusing on who initiated contact with whom, who drove narratives forward, who filled gaps with speculation that hardened into belief. Phone logs, where available, were reconstructed. Meeting notes were cross-referenced. Patterns of communication emerged that showed how quickly certain ideas spread, how certain voices carried disproportionate influence, and how those voices often traced back to the same small circle. The abandoned car, once again, became a psychological anchor, and analysts proposed a chilling interpretation that leaving it was not just misdirection, but an assertion of control, a way to dictate the starting point of the story. By fixing the narrative there, on that road, the perpetrator ensured that everything else unfolded downstream from a location of his choosing. It was a strategy that relied on confidence, on knowing that investigators would commit resources outward from that point, leaving other paths relatively untouched. This interpretation reframed the crime as not only calculated, but patient, an act committed by someone who expected to live with its consequences, to manage them, to adapt as needed. Such individuals do not flee. They remain, blending back into the environment, monitoring reactions, adjusting behavior just enough to avoid suspicion. Time for them is not a threat but an ally. The family, now briefed on the seriousness of these developments, struggled with a different kind of pain, the realization that the truth, when it emerged, might not bring the relief they had once imagined. Closure, they had learned, is a myth when justice arrives decades late. What they wanted now was honesty, a narrative stripped of convenience, even if it meant living with uncertainty rather than accepting another lie. Media interest flickered again, drawn by whispers rather than statements, and investigators worked actively to contain it, knowing that public speculation could harden positions, alert individuals under scrutiny, and damage fragile progress. Silence became a tool, uncomfortable but necessary, and within that silence, the case advanced in small, deliberate steps. One such step involved revisiting the letter discovered earlier, the one with details that should not have been known. Linguistic analysts compared its phrasing to other writings associated with the alternative suspect, not expecting a definitive match, but looking for stylistic resonance. The results were cautious but compelling, shared patterns of emphasis, similar constructions, a way of asserting knowledge without direct ownership. It was not evidence admissible in court, but it was intelligence, guiding attention with renewed confidence. Investigators also considered motive more openly now, not as speculation, but as a necessary component of understanding. They examined power dynamics, unspoken conflicts, moments where control might have been challenged or threatened. Motive did not emerge as a single dramatic event, but as an accumulation of grievances, perceived slights, unmet expectations, the kind that simmer quietly and find release when opportunity aligns. That opportunity, they believed, had presented itself on a night that appeared ordinary, when routines intersected and no one was watching closely. The lack of witnesses was not luck, but planning, the exploitation of predictability. This understanding cast the entire case in a new, darker light, transforming it from a tragedy of chance into one of intention. As pressure increased, investigators debated next steps, knowing that escalation carried risk. Confrontation without proof could close doors permanently, drive behavior underground, or contaminate potential evidence. Yet waiting too long risked the same outcome, allowing time to erode what little remained. Balancing those risks required discipline, coordination, and restraint, qualities that had been lacking in the early days but were now fiercely protected. The town moved through another winter unaware of how close the past had come to resurfacing, unaware that conversations held in quiet rooms, questions asked gently but persistently, were reshaping a story thought long finished. That disconnect was unsettling, The way truth can hover just beneath the surface of ordinary life, unseen, unfelt, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. As the investigation entered its next phase, the sense of inevitability grew, not certainty, but momentum, the feeling that the narrative, once destabilized, could not return to its old shape. The lie that had sustained the case for decades was no longer sufficient, and whatever replaced it would demand reckoning, not just from one individual, but from a system and a community that had accepted comfort over clarity for far too long. The Ohio 1992 cold case remained unresolved on paper, but in reality it had shifted into something far more volatile, a living question pressing against the present, testing the strength of assumptions, forcing choices that could no longer be delayed. And as investigators prepared to make those choices, they understood that the next steps would not simply seek answers. They would challenge the story everyone had learned to live with, and that challenge, once issued, could not be taken back. By the time spring arrived, the investigation had entered a phase defined less by discovery than by confrontation. Not the dramatic kind shown in headlines, but the slow, grinding confrontation between competing versions of reality. The team understood now that the truth, if it surfaced, would do so reluctantly, under pressure applied from multiple angles, and that pressure had to be calibrated carefully, because a story maintained for decades does not collapse all at once. It sheds pieces, fragments falling away until what remains can no longer stand on its own. The alternative suspect was brought in again, this time with a different approach, not to accuse, not to corner, but to observe how he responded when presented with information he did not expect investigators to have. They spoke casually about search areas, about overlooked routes, about the early misdirection that had shaped the case, watching his reactions closely. He nodded at points that should have surprised him, displayed familiarity with developments he had not been briefed on, and when corrected, laughed it off, attributing it to guesswork, intuition, coincidence. Coincidence, however, loses its power when it accumulates, and investigators felt that accumulation pressing in. They noted how his language shifted subtly when discussions approached certain locations, how he redirected conversation toward safer ground, how he emphasized the impossibility of proving anything after so much time. That emphasis was telling, because it revealed where he believed the case's weakness lay, in the erosion of evidence, in the assumption that time protects those who wait long enough. Behind the scenes, legal teams debated strategy, weighing the possibility of presenting the case to a grand jury not to secure an indictment immediately, but to compel testimony, to lock statements into record, to introduce consequences for inconsistency. It was a risky move, one that could backfire if mishandled, but the alternative, endless investigation without leverage, risked stagnation. The question was no longer whether there was enough suspicion, but whether there was enough discipline to translate suspicion into something durable. Investigators also revisited individuals who had played supporting roles in the early narrative, people whose statements had reinforced assumptions without being scrutinized. Some were cooperative, expressing regret that they had not questioned more, that they had accepted prevailing theories without challenge. Others were less forthcoming, defensive, resistant to revisiting a past they believed settled. That resistance was not proof of guilt, but it reinforced the sense that the case had been socially stabilized around a lie, maintained by collective reluctance to reopen old wounds. The family, increasingly aware that the investigation was approaching a critical juncture, prepared themselves emotionally for outcomes they could not control. They spoke privately about expectations, about what justice might look like if certainty proved impossible, about whether naming a likely perpetrator without charges would bring peace or only new pain. These conversations were quiet, painful, necessary, reflections of a resilience forged not by closure, but by endurance. One development, unexpected and unsettling, emerged from a review of unrelated case files from the same era, reports of incidents that had never risen to the level of formal investigation, moments of intimidation, boundary crossing, behavior that made people uncomfortable but not alarmed enough to act. When these reports were mapped alongside known movements and relationships, a pattern of proximity reappeared, faint but consistent, suggesting that the crime in question may not have been an isolated rupture, but part of a continuum of behavior that had gone unchecked. This possibility shifted the moral weight of the case, reframing it not just as a singular tragedy, but as a failure of recognition, a series of missed opportunities where discomfort was dismissed, where familiarity masked threat. Investigators grappled with that implication, because it suggested that the lie sustaining the case was not just individual, but collective, a shared unwillingness to see what was inconvenient. As pressure increased, the alternative suspect's behavior changed in small but significant ways. He limited contact, deferred interviews, cited health concerns, consulted legal counsel more frequently. These actions were within his rights, unremarkable in isolation, but together they marked a retreat, a narrowing of engagement that investigators interpreted as awareness. He was not confessing, not breaking, but he was repositioning, preparing for a future in which the past might no longer be safely contained. The confession that once dominated public attention now felt like a relic, a blunt instrument compared to the precision required here. Its collapse had taught investigators a critical lesson, that truth cannot be forced into existence by desire alone, and that false certainty can be more damaging than uncertainty honestly acknowledged. In rejecting that confession, they had reclaimed the integrity of the investigation, even as it complicated the path forward. Internally, the team confronted its own fears, not of failure but of success, because success here would demand accountability, not just from a suspect, but from institutions that had accepted flawed narratives, from processes that had prioritized closure over rigor. Solving the case would not be a triumphal moment. It would be a reckoning, exposing the cost of convenience and the fragility of trust. As summer approached, discussions turned toward what could be said publicly and what could not, how to prepare a community for the possibility that answers might come without arrests, that truth might emerge in the form of probability rather than proof. This was an uncomfortable prospect, because society is conditioned to equate justice with verdicts, with sentences, with definitive endings, and anything less feels like failure. Yet investigators understood that cold cases rarely conform to that expectation, and that insisting on a narrative of resolution can perpetuate harm. The goal, they agreed, was to articulate the truth as clearly as evidence allowed, to expose the lie that had shaped the case, and to do so with humility, acknowledging what could not be known alongside what could. The town, largely oblivious to these deliberations, continued its rhythms, unaware that the ground beneath its collective memory was shifting. That obliviousness was both a shield and a vulnerability, because when truth arrives after long absence, it disrupts not just those directly involved, but the stories people tell themselves about safety, familiarity, and the past. As the investigation moved closer to a decision point, the sense of inevitability intensified, not the inevitability of a solution but of change. The Ohio 1992 cold case could no longer remain suspended in ambiguity, propped up by a confession already exposed as false. Something would have to give, whether in the form of charges, public acknowledgement, or an official statement reframing the case's history. And in that tension, in that narrowing space between silence and revelation, the case revealed its final cruelty, that after decades of waiting, the truth might emerge not as a clean answer, but as a demand to confront how easily a lie can persist when it is easier to believe than the alternative, and how much courage it takes, after so long, to finally let it fall. The decision, when it came, did not arrive with certainty, only resolve, a collective agreement that the case could no longer drift, that allowing the lie to remain unchallenged was itself a form of injustice. Investigators prepared a comprehensive internal report, not a dramatic reveal, but a meticulous reconstruction of what could be established, what was strongly indicated, and what would likely never be proven. It was a document shaped by restraint, careful language, and the understanding that words, once released, could not be retrieved. At the center of that report was a narrative that differed sharply from the one the community had lived with for decades. It rejected the false confession outright, not as a failed solution but as an intrusion that had distorted the pursuit of truth. It detailed the early assumptions that had narrowed the investigation prematurely, the blind spots created by those assumptions, and the way influence, familiarity, and convenience had shaped decisions at every stage. It named no certainty where certainty did not exist, but it pointed unmistakably toward a conclusion that had become impossible to ignore. The alternative suspect's name appeared not as an accusation, but as a focal point of probability, supported by behavioral patterns, access, opportunity, and narrative control. The report acknowledged the absence of definitive physical evidence, the erosion caused by time, and the legal reality that charges might never be viable. Yet it also made clear that the weight of accumulated indicators could not be dismissed as coincidence, that taken together, they formed a picture more coherent than any other explanation offered over the years. Legal counsel reviewed the document with caution, line by line, aware that its release could invite scrutiny, backlash, even litigation. Every phrase was debated, every implication tested, because this was not about winning a case, but about standing behind a truth that would be challenged precisely because it was incomplete. The question was not whether the report was perfect, but whether it was honest. The family was briefed before anything became public, invited into a room that felt heavy with anticipation and dread. Investigators spoke plainly, explaining what they believed had happened, why they believed it, and where uncertainty remained. There were no promises, no declarations of justice finally served, only an acknowledgement that the story they had been told for decades was wrong, and that the truth, while painful, deserved to be spoken. They listened in silence, absorbing details that reframed years of waiting, moments of hope, waves of disappointment. Some of it confirmed instincts they had carried quietly for a long time, suspicions they had been discouraged from voicing. Other parts reopened wounds they had tried to close, forcing them to confront the possibility that the person responsible had lived openly, unchallenged, while they mourned in uncertainty. When the briefing ended, there was no sense of relief, only a sober clarity, a recognition that truth does not heal automatically. It simply stops the bleeding from being hidden. The alternative suspect was informed through counsel, the conversation brief, procedural, devoid of accusation but heavy with implication. His response was measured, controlled, a reiteration of innocence, an emphasis on the impossibility of proof. He did not lash out, did not confess, did not collapse. Instead, he retreated further behind legal boundaries, a move anticipated and noted, because it aligned with the pattern investigators had observed all along: withdrawal rather than confrontation, distance rather than denial. As preparations were made for a public statement, the team debated tone more than content. They knew that the community would want certainty, names, consequences, and that offering anything less would feel unsatisfying, even infuriating. Yet they also knew that overstating conclusions would perpetuate the very problem they were trying to correct, replacing one lie with another. The final language reflected that tension, careful, precise, resistant to sensationalism. When the statement was released, it did not explode across headlines. It spread slowly, unevenly, interpreted and reinterpreted by those who read between the lines. It acknowledged the false confession as a decades-long lie, clarified that the case was not solved in the conventional sense, and presented a revised understanding of events grounded in evidence and analysis rather than desire. It stopped short of naming guilt, but it did not shy away from pointing toward responsibility. Reactions were mixed: confusion, anger, disbelief, relief, all colliding in public discourse. Some accused investigators of cowardice for not making an arrest. Others praised the honesty, the refusal to pretend certainty where none existed. The family watched this unfold with a distance born of exhaustion, knowing that public reaction was transient, while their reality was permanent. Within the department, the release marked an end and a beginning, the closure of one chapter and the acceptance that the case might never move beyond this point. There were no celebrations, no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that the truth, as far as it could be known, had finally been allowed into the light. That mattered, even if it did not satisfy every expectation. The alternative suspect continued his life under a shadow now visible to those who looked closely, a shadow not imposed by accusation, but by implication. He remained free, legally untouched, but no longer insulated by anonymity. This outcome troubled some investigators, who wanted more, but others recognized it as an inevitable consequence of time, a reminder that justice delayed alters not just evidence, but possibility itself. As the dust settled, the town began to absorb the revised narrative, conversations shifting, old assumptions questioned, familiar faces viewed with new unease. The realization that the truth had been closer than anyone wanted to admit unsettled deeply held beliefs about safety and familiarity. The lie had not come from outside. It had grown quietly within. The Ohio 1992 cold case, once framed as finally solved, now stood as something more complicated. A case not closed, but clarified, its false ending stripped away, its real contours exposed. It was not the resolution people crave, but it was an honesty long denied. And in that honesty lay a different kind of justice, imperfect, incomplete, but real. And as the story reached this point, balanced between what could be proven and what could only be understood, one truth became impossible to ignore, that the most enduring damage of the case was not just the crime itself, but the decades spent believing a lie because it was easier than living with uncertainty, and that confronting that lie, at last, was both the end of one story and the beginning of another, one that would continue to echo long after the headlines faded. In the months that followed, the case settled into a strange afterlife, no longer actively pursued, but not truly finished, existing in that uneasy space where truth has been spoken without being fully enforced. Investigators returned to other work, other files, other tragedies. Yet the Ohio 1992 cold case lingered in their thoughts, not as a failure, but as a lesson carved deeply into professional memory, a reminder of how easily momentum can replace rigor, how comforting narratives can outlive facts if no one is willing to challenge them. For the family, life did not reset, it recalibrated. The years of waiting had taught them how to function alongside absence, but this new clarity demanded a different kind of adjustment. They spoke of her more openly now, not as a symbol of an unsolved mystery, but as a person whose story had been distorted by time and convenience. The knowledge that the false confession had been exposed brought no joy, but it removed a weight, the burden of having believed something that never quite felt right. In its place was grief refined by understanding, pain sharpened but honest. They visited familiar places with new eyes, the road where the car was found, the neighborhoods where routines once overlapped, spaces that had felt neutral now charged with implication. These were not scenes of closure, but of reckoning, moments where memory and reality collided, forcing acknowledgement that the danger had not been random, not fleeting, but woven into the fabric of everyday life. That realization was unsettling, but it was also clarifying, stripping away illusions that had offered comfort at the cost of truth. The alternative suspect remained silent publicly, his denials unchanged, his posture carefully managed. He lived with the knowledge that while the law had not moved against him, the story around him had shifted irrevocably. Conversations paused when he entered rooms. Familiar glances lingered longer than before. The protection of anonymity, once absolute, had eroded, replaced by a quiet scrutiny that required no verdict to be effective. This was not justice in the traditional sense, but it was consequence, the social echo of suspicion grounded not in rumor, but in articulated probability. Within the community, discussions grew more nuanced, less certain. Some resisted the revised narrative, clinging to the comfort of a solved case, a confession neatly filed away. Others embraced the discomfort, recognizing that certainty built on falsehood is a fragile shield. The case became a reference point in conversations about trust, about how well people truly know those around them, about the cost of assuming safety without questioning it. It changed how stories were told, how memories were framed, how silence was interpreted. Law enforcement agencies beyond the town took note, studying the case not for its outcome, but for its process. Training materials referenced it quietly, emphasizing the dangers of premature closure, the importance of revisiting assumptions, the ethical responsibility to resist easy answers even when pressure demands them. The false confession, once heralded as resolution, became a cautionary example, proof that the desire for endings can be exploited, intentionally or not, with lasting consequences. As years passed, the case receded from headlines entirely, but it did not disappear. It lived on in institutional memory, in family stories, in the subtle way the town carried itself. Anniversaries were marked privately now, without cameras, without statements, candles lit not for spectacle, but for remembrance. The absence remained, but it was no longer defined by confusion alone. It was defined by an understanding hard-won and imperfect. There were moments, quiet ones, when investigators revisited the file alone, rereading notes, wondering if something had still been missed, if one more question, one different decision, might have changed everything. Those moments never fully went away, because cold cases imprint themselves permanently on those who work them. They are not puzzles solved and set aside. They are responsibilities that linger, shaping how future decisions are made. The Ohio 1992 cold case never received the ending promised by its headline. There was no arrest that shocked the community, no confession that stood up to scrutiny, no courtroom reckoning to anchor grief in verdict. Instead, it offered something rarer and more unsettling, a truth stripped of ceremony, an acknowledgement that the story everyone accepted for decades was wrong, and that the real narrative was quieter, more complex, and far more disturbing. In the end, what remained was not closure, but clarity, and clarity carries its own burden. It demands that people live with ambiguity without filling it with lies, that they accept justice not as a moment, but as a process constrained by time, memory, and human limitation. It asks for humility, for the courage to say, "We do not know everything," even when the world insists on answers. The case left behind a final echo not of sirens or headlines, but of a question that refused to fade. How many other stories had been shaped the same way? How many truths lay buried beneath narratives chosen for convenience rather than accuracy? That question lingered in the spaces between certainty and doubt, urging vigilance, urging patience, urging a refusal to accept easy endings. And so the story closed not with resolution, but with an absence that had been given a name, not solved, but seen, not silenced, but understood. The Ohio 1992 cold case remained what it had always been, a reminder that time does not heal what is hidden, that lies can endure for decades if they are allowed to, and that confronting them, even without the promise of punishment, is an act of justice in itself. The voice fades not because the mystery has ended, but because it has finally been told honestly, leaving behind a truth that does not comfort, does not satisfy, but endures, heavy and undeniable. A shadow stretching from a winter night in 1992 into the present, asking only that it not be ignored again.